Hello and welcome to another tutorial on ASP.NET Core. This is going to be part 6, and we're mainly going to talk about ASP.NET security, specifically with authentication and authorization. Now, to understand the authentication authorization in ASP.NET, what we're going to do is we're going to create a quick example and show you the usage of it. In modern web application, security and privacy of the user data is very important. Now imagine having an e-commerce website. Now in this website you'll have authentication, and mainly this authentication will allow you to register on a website, store some of your information like your credit card and your address, and so for the subsequent purchases you can keep track of your order history, have your payments and already registered with and saved with the site so that you can use it again for new orders and such. So that's basically what authentication is is to register on a website. But then there's an aspect of it called authorization. So what is authorization? Authentication is just giving you credentials to register with the website. The authorization part of it is to give you access to parts of the site that you may not all users may have. So let's say, for example, you're creating a blog website. And this blog website, as an admin, you can actually create new blog posts, but as a less of role for an admin would be an editor, for example. And an editor person cannot create new blogs, but they can edit existing blogs. So an admin would go and create a new blog, and then another role would be able to access and edit those things. So that's basically roles are being introduced. But for the authorization is to give access to certain parts of your application that allow some people to do something and others not. So in this tutorial, what we're going to do is we're going to guide you through the process of setting up ASP.NET using core identity in your web application and implementing a user registration and logging and using roles, for example, for claims or authorization, protecting different resources. These would be different pages that we're going to create secure versus non-secure. And then hopefully by the end of this tutorial, you'll have a good understanding, because this is going to be a general discussion about authorization authentication. So we're not going to go so deep as to get everything out of it because of time constraints. And at some point I might do another tutorial to talk about all those details, but this should give you a very good understanding of where to start and setting up your site with authentication authorization. All right, with that said, let's start our new ASP.NET Core project and add the packages for the ASP.NET Core identity. So here we are in our Visual Studio, and I have my SQL Server inside of the Docker container, and the Docker container is running. And I also have my SQL Studio Manager running, and as you can see I have my blogs database, but we're not going to be using the blog database. We're going to create a new one. So I just wanted to have this up here so we can go back and see the tables and stuff that are going to be created when we create our project. So let's go ahead in Visual Studio, select New Project. In here, we're going to, because we've used the ASP.NET Core web app as part of my recent projects. If not, you would have to then go through your C# platforms and choose web, and then the ASP.NET Core web API web app will be in here. So for us, we're just going to use this and go ahead and double click, select next. Now here, I'm going to just write the name of the project, so it's going to be Web Security Sample, and I'm going to keep everything else as default and choose next. Here we're going to choose the .NET 7, so we're going to keep that as is. And the authentication type, what we're going to do is we're going to use individual accounts. Now we have multiple. We have none, meaning that you can basically allow anonymous, and then you can actually implement your own security if you wanted to. And then using individual accounts, which is going to be the ASP.NET identity. And then of course we also have the Microsoft Identity Platform. This is connecting to, like, for example, Outlook.com. So you could use accounts from that to be able to authenticate to your website, or using Windows. Now in the Windows section, it will only be available to Windows systems that this application is going to be installed. But because we might be installing this in a Docker container that might have Linux, let's just go ahead and use individual accounts. And also this time we're going to keep the checkmark for configure HTTPS. So anytime moving forward, you should have this enabled because when you're doing authentication and security, you want to make sure that everything is secure using SSL and all the packages are encrypted through the network. So, but everything else we're going to leave off. So just keep it like this, and let's go ahead and create. Okay, so now we have our project created, and let's go ahead and run this. So here we have our project up and running, and we have our logging. So if you had your user and email and password, you could add that in here. Or you can, if you forgot your password, or you can go back and register as a new user, maybe resend email confirmation. So these are all created by default for you. So if you go to register as a new user, basically you would have your email, your password, and confirm password here, and click register, and that would create an account for you. Same as if you click register, you come to the same page. So this is what the default page, the default settings going to give you. So if we go back here, and let's go ahead and stop our ASP.NET. Now, because this is using the template, and if we go into the program section, and if you look at the default connection string that is grabbing, it should be in our app settings. So if we go to our app settings, notice that it is going to the local DB, and then the database ASP.NET. It has this weird GUID back here, and then the web security sample. Now, if you look over to your left side, in the previous tutorial, we've gone over this section on how Visual Studio connects and has these things set up. So we won't really go over that, but this is the one that it is looking to. So if we expand this and the database, you'll notice that we don't have a database here. And the reason you don't have a database is that the template created all the files, but none of the tables or anything like that. And so to do that, we'll do that next by running the application, but there's multiple ways of doing that. So we'll just run the application and take a look. So let's go to our registration, and let's go ahead and add our email, and we'll just have a password, and click register. So now this actually fails, and the reason it fails is that there is no database created. There is no migration, meaning that there's no database. So click apply the migration, or in Visual Studio, go and say update the database. And then alternatively, you can say .NET EF database update. So let's just do it through the web. Now, if you do it through the web, and you click apply, this means that you have the credentials to be able to do that. So it's going to do is create the application DB context. So click apply, and now, and then it's asking us to refresh the page. So if we refresh the page, now our user is created, and then it says click here to confirm your account. So now our account is confirmed. Let's go back to login, and then let's go ahead and put in our passwords, and we logged in with our credentials. So if I go back to my name, you can see now that I've come to my profile, and my email has been confirmed. There's my email. You can have a phone number in here if you wanted to. You can go in here and have your email. Then you have your password here if you want to update that. And then you have this two-factor authentication, and then you have your personal data where you could download or delete. So this is by default created for you. Now what we're going to do is instead of using the defaults, we're going to create a new blank web security. You're going to delete this and then create a new one, and then we'll go walk through how to add this yourself. Now it's worth mentioning that if you come back here and go back over to your project, and if you look under the data, so this is where the migration existed. This is what it created for us, and this is what it applied. This is our application DB context. And if we go to our pages, there's all our default pages. But notice there's nothing here as far as security. So if we go into this area section, you'll notice you have identity and you have pages. In this pages, you have this view start, meaning this is the shared layout that it's going to use. Well, how did all of this stuff work if we don't have these? Well, these are Razor pages that are embedded in an assembly, and we'll take a look and see how that's going to be, how it was done. And then based on some configs, that's how what you're seeing on your website. But there's nothing else in here, right? So there's no magic to this. So let's go ahead and also kind of quickly look. So if we refresh this, we now have our web security sample. And if we open this, we should see some tables in here. And the tables are basically, there's our users, user roles, ASP.NET user logins, claims, a bunch of tables created here for us, as well as the ASP.NET user tokens. And then, of course, we have the EF migration history. This is where it's going to keep track of all of the changes that you make to the tables and stuff. So now that you get a quick overview of how this is set up through the template, let's actually do this from scratch. We'll do that next. So before we move on, actually, I forgot to go over one thing, to go over the program.cs file and all the changes that we did. So here should be everything familiar to you guys of all the things we've gone over. We have a builder, which is our build application. And then from that, we have our connection string. This should be familiar to you guys, as well as we have adding a DB context. And this is the application DB context. And the option is to use SQL Server and as a connection string, which we got up here. Next, you'll see that we have this thing called Services Add Database Developer Page Exception Filter. And we'll go over this in a little bit. So this is a new thing that's been added into our services. Then we have this thing, Builder Services. Now we're adding the default identity, which is the identity user, and it's using our application DB context for the entity framework store. And the rest should be familiar to you guys. We're using the add Razor pages. We do a build, and then we check to see if it's development, and then use migration endpoint. And then if not, then we have the exception handler, and we have some redirects and routing, authorization, and map Razor pages. Then finally, we run the application. So what happened was when we ran our project, notice that we didn't have database created, and so this is set up for us to where it captures the database exceptions because it's a template and by default it didn't have a database. We saw that page where it added our migration. So that was done because we were in a development environment. So if we are in development, then we're going to use the migration endpoint page where we can select the button to do the migration where it's going to create a database for us. So here we are with our Visual Studio. Let's go ahead and create a new blank project. And this time make sure that you select the ASP.NET Core Web App. And we'll double click. Now for the name of it, I'm actually going to name it Web Security Example. So let's go ahead and choose next. Now in here we're going to choose none because we're going to do everything ourselves. We're going to keep the configure for HTTPS and keep the .NET 7 standard. And let's go ahead and create. So this went ahead and created our project. And let's go ahead and make sure that we can build this. Okay, so the build succeeded. So everything is doing good, except now we need to integrate the identity that we talked about previously. So we can go ahead and right-click on our project and say Add. And then in here, we're going to choose New Scaffold Item. So in here, you can see there's a lot of things we can scaffold, but the one that we're interested in is the identity, and select that. Click Add. Now here, you'll see a dialog, and it's going to have a lot of pages for us. So here we have all of the pages that we want. Now we can be selective and choosing very specific pages, but I'm going to select Override All Files and select all of them. Next, it requires a DB context. I don't have one because it's a blank project, so we'll just say Add. And let's just choose the default web security example context, click Add. It's going to automatically choose the database provider as SQL for us, but you could use SQLite if you wanted to. I'm going to use SQL Server. Now, as far as the user class, it doesn't have anything, so I'm going to click Add. And I'm just going to keep this name the same, Web Security Example User. Click Add, and click Add. Now we're going to go through and create all the pages for us. This is going to be a little bit different than the previous one, where everything was coming from a assembly, all the pages, except in this one, you'll see all the pages and the code behind for it within your project, so that you can actually go in and modify the pages if you wanted to format it and do different things with it. So now that it's created, we have our scaffolding readme.txt, but basically it gives us some information. Let's go ahead and close that. And now let's actually inspect our program. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our program.cs to see what the changes were. And if we come over here, you'll notice that we have pretty much the same thing as the previous project, except now that we have an error here. Well, this error is because the namespace is not set correctly. So if we set that properly, everything should now work. So what about the pages and what about the data stuff that we see here? So if we come to pages, this is going to be normal. And if we go to areas, now we do have a folder called areas. If you go to identity, we get data and pages. In the data, we have our context and we have our user. And then in the pages, now we have a lot more pages in here that we can use to do whatever we want. So for this example, I added everything in here. And if you go into the manage, we have even more. So let's go ahead and build this. Now, if we build this and run this, it's not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is because all we did was add the files. So we're going to have the same issue as before, where when you run this program, it's going to have an issue where there's no database for it. So it's not going to be able to do anything. So if we come into the programs, notice that it has a connection string, and it's getting that connection string from our app.json settings, which is going into our local with the name Web Security Example. Now, this doesn't exist, so if we run this, you're going to get an error. So how do you add this? Let's go ahead and go to our Package Manager console. Now, you can get this by going to Tools and go to NuGet Package Manager and choose the Package Manager console. So the next thing we need to do is to kind of list out where we are. Right now, we're at the root of the project. So what we need to do is we need to be inside of this folder where the project file is. So we're just going to go cd and then the name of the folder. So now if we do list, you can see that now we're inside of the project. We have our errors and everything else. So the next thing we need to do is figure out how to add our all of the migration files. So remember in the previous one, we went to the data section. We had a migration folder where we had the migration scripts. And how do you do that? So there's a couple of things we need to do. So first, actually, if we do what was stated in the page that we ran into where we could do the migration, it's said to go ahead and update the database. Now, if we run this, it'll try to build our project. And then it's going to execute this script. And this script, actually, if you look carefully, you'll notice it says create a database web security example. But there are no files associated here. So, and even if we go to our Server Explorer or our SQL Server and go over here to our database, we see our web security, but none of the tables that we want is in there. But we do have our EF migration history. This is not going to help us. So what would be another command that we can run in order to get this? Now, before running this command, there is another thing we need to do is to make sure that we have the EF tools in order to run the command. So let's go ahead and see what that is. So what we need to do is run the following command. And what it's doing is it's saying go to the .NET tool install and add the .NET entity framework into a global section. And the reason for this is so that we can access this. So let's go ahead and run this. Now, I already have mine installed, so This is why I'm seeing this error, so you can ignore it. But if you don't have it, if this is the first time you're doing this, you do need to run this command. So the next command we wanted to run is actually adding the migration. And to do that, we're gonna use the EF entity framework migration by adding the initial identity migration. So this should create all of the scripts that we need. We're going to go ahead and rebuild the project and then add all our EF migration. So now if you look, you notice that we have the migration folder, and if we expand this, we have our migration files here that we can use. So the next command now is to go back and do update database, and if we run this, it's going to use our migration scripts. As you can see, it's creating all the tables for us. And now that it's finished, we can confirm by refreshing this. And you can see that all our tables are created. Now the next thing is, if we run this, you're actually not going to see any of the logging stuff. And the reason for that is because, remember, we created a blank page, although we have all of the identity stuff in here, but none of it's linked within the index page that we have. So to fix this so we can see our logging and registration, we need to go and update our pages. So if we come into the shared, we do see a new file called loginpartial.cshtml. Now this has the information about whether you're logged in, or if you want to log out, what the user's name is and everything, right? So where do we add this? So this would be part of the layout. So we can go to the layout and come down, and right after the privacy pieces, and right about over here, we need to add this partial page inside. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste, and now it's going to have the login partial, which is the page we were looking for. And if we run this now, so now we can see our registration and login. So if you click login, you have your login page. Since this is the first time, we don't have anything here. Let's go ahead and create our user. I'm going to go ahead and put my password. And let's go ahead and register. And everything is fine. So let's go ahead and click to confirm our account. And let's go ahead and do login. And let's remember me. Click login. And now we're logged in. If we go here, you can see that everything worked. And we have all the information that we want as previously, except this was all done manually. So I think this is a good place to stop, because I wanted to get these video tutorials out much quicker than I have previously. So in the next section of the ASP.NET Core Part 7, where we'll still look into the security, authentication, authorization, but in that we actually look into the table structure and the schema and all of those files that were generated to manage the identity of the user, and how to also extend it and add our own columns and our own data. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next one.